Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kathy Darling Allen. I'm the Shasta County Clerk and Registrar of Voters. I'm also very proud to be the Chairman of the Board of the California Voter Foundation and a member of the Advisory Board for the Future of California Collaborative. And I really have valued my experience and my time with FOS. I was a founding member, and I cannot recommend FOS highly enough. Our opening panel this afternoon is going to explore a really important question, something that is pounding at the brains of all of us election officials, which is California prepared for November 2020? The panel is going to be moderated this afternoon by Jessica Huseman. And Jessica, I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. I apologize if not. She's the lead reporter for ProPublica's Electionland project, which helps newsrooms across the U.S. cover ballot access issues in real time. This project has won awards from the Online News Association, the Global Editors Network, and the Society for Professional Journalists. Thank you, Jessica, very much for your time today and for leading this important discussion.
Great, thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here. I really appreciate it. I apologize in advance if there's a bit of background noise, but I will mute myself when I'm not talking. My internet went out this morning, so I'm sitting in the lobby of a Hampton Inn. I guess we're all doing what we have to do these days. I am pleased to have with me on this panel Neil Kelly, the Registrar of Voters for Orange County, California. They were the first county in the state to conduct an election under these terms, and he can speak to his experiences so far. We'll also have Fred Nissen, who is a supervising attorney for voting rights for Disability Rights California, who will talk about how these changes are impacting voters who need special assistance at the polls. And then also James Schwab, who is the Deputy Secretary of State for Policy and Planning for the Office of the California Secretary of State for Alex Padilla, who you just heard from. So I don't want to take up too much more time, so let's go ahead and move first to Neil Kelly, who will walk us through a few slides on his recent experiences. And if you have questions, please throw them in the Q&A. I'm going to hold audience questions until the last few minutes of the panel, but if you have any questions that come to mind while the panelists are talking, please type them right in there. All right, Neil, it's all you.
Hey, listen, I wanted to say, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here this morning or this afternoon and to talk about this important topic. I think all of us up and down the state, my colleagues, would say that we could all write books about things that we've experienced in elections, but who knew that the first chapter would be a pandemic, a global pandemic. And so this is just very odd times for me. I think one of the things that's important to point out is that election officials, and I know this, I see them in their hearts and my colleagues up and down the state, that we want to do the right thing. And even though it's a challenge moving into November, we stand the test to stand up and make sure that we're ensuring voters have the rights that they can cast a ballot fairly and freely. And so with that, I just want to talk about, and I don't know, can we advance my slides? I don't know if I can see those. While we're queuing those up, I just wanted to tell you that what I'd like to talk about today is in the weeds. 2 elections that we conducted just recently. Well, actually, we have one on Tuesday for a City of Santa Ana election under COVID-19 restrictions, an RLA under COVID-19 restrictions, and I'm currently managing a recount under COVID-19 restrictions. So this has all hit me at once. You can see there on the left, April 7th, we had a Westminster special election for a recall election. And what was unusual about that is that the governor's order allowing for limited in-person options came after we had already mailed the ballots and the voter information guide out to voters. So it was a challenge to try and step in and communicate to voters what those changes were. And then on the right there, you see on May 19th, we have a special election in the city of Santa Ana that's coming up. That was a little bit different because the governor's order came out before we mailed vote by mail ballots and voter information guides. So 2 different challenges on how we communicated to voters. And I want to walk you through that. If you could go to the next slide, please. So just a timeline on this Westminster recall. March 12th, we mailed ballots out to voters. On March 20th, the governor issued his executive order. And on March 25th, we mailed supplemental VIGs and postcards to voters with COVID-19 information. One of the things that we did in the communication was make it very clear that due to COVID-19 restrictions and the safety of not only our staff, but voters, we were limiting in-person voting only to our Santa Ana location. And so that eliminated several vote center locations in the city of Westminster. And I should probably add that we are a vote center county. I think most of you know that under the Voters' Choice Act. And so we already have the infrastructure built in for drop boxes and other abilities for voters to return ballots quickly and easily. But it made that challenge because voters were already starting to return ballots, and then we switched kind of midstream to this no in-person option. If you go to the next slide for me. One of the things that we did is mail out a postcard immediately to the voters. This was a large postcard, it wasn't a small one. And on the back was very clear, large urgent notice that in-person voting locations for the City of Westminster election were closed due to COVID-19 restrictions. And we gave them options on that card for a couple of things. One is a remote accessible vote by mail access if they fell into that category, voters with disabilities. And we also included information about COVID-19. And if they were impacted from a medical perspective of COVID-19, they could go into that REVBM solution and use that as an option for them. Interestingly enough, only 13 voters accessed that system. Nobody returned a ballot under the REVBM solution. So that was interesting. Next slide. And by the way, that was in all languages to all voters in Westminster. Did a lot of press releases, a lot of information out to the media. We tried to spread this far and wide as much as we could. We worked with the City of Westminster to get information out to voters. And surprisingly, we did not receive a lot of phone calls in terms of voters being confused or not sure what to do. We had information on our website in all the languages that we support in the City of Westminster. And we got some good coverage just in terms of getting information out to voters. Next slide. So updated our letter in the voter information guide for supplemental VIGs that was sent out. That was in red. I have a letter that you see right there at the beginning of the VIG and explaining to voters their options. And their options were, everybody got a ballot. We told them when it was mailed. Everybody has the option of returning that ballot in a variety of ways. Postage paid in the mail. They could drop it off in the City of Westminster drop box, several locations throughout the city that they could use, or they could come into our office in Santa Ana and use an in-person option if they had no other options for casting a ballot. Website's really important. I think we did see a lot of traffic just initially when we first mailed out those postcards where voters were going on and looking for information about what to do with respect to casting a ballot. Now, this is one of the things I wanted to bring up in terms of people asking me, do you think turnout's going to be up or down in the November election? Hard to predict, but what I saw in Westminster, highest turnout in a special recall election in 25 years in Orange County. Now, I guess that could be two things. One, that could be the politics in Westminster are very intense, and sometimes that's going to drive an engaged turnout, but it could also be a product of, hey, I'm at home, I'm in quarantine, I've got a ballot in front of me, and therefore I'm going to take an extra step maybe to engage and participate in this election when I may not have done that otherwise. So I think that was good that we saw that high turnout and engagement. Next slide. Notice of vote center closures were posted on all of the in-person sites so voters could see that. I'm going to kind of fast forward here because we're running out of time. Next slide. This is a picture of, it was raining pretty hard for a couple of days for the in-person voting. And what I saw, and this is something I've talked to my colleagues about, is that the campaigns are driving people to the in-person option. It was not the voters that were calling us saying, I need this in-person option. So we had about 70 total that turned out to vote, driven mostly by campaigns, and I think we're definitely going to see that in November. Risk limiting audit, we conducted that for the City of Westminster. That was using social distancing. I won't go into too many details here other than to say that was a lot easier to manage than the election itself because we were able to social distance in our building. Next slide. This is the fun one. I'm in the middle of a recount for the City of Westminster right now, and we're running two boards, social distancing, online, video observation for the observers, as well as the ability to challenge ballots. This is crazy. And I say crazy in a good word, just in terms of the logistics and the challenges of managing the space and still providing the rights that people have in a recount. And that was certainly a challenge, but I think we made it work pretty well. Next slide. Just some more pictures of the recount. Let's advance if we could, please. I know I'm about 30 seconds out here. Just real quick for the Santa Ana recall, this was, again, a good thing because the governor's order came out before we mailed out anything to the voters. And I see I'm out of time, so if we could just advance a couple slides, I want to talk just quickly about November. You can see some information there from Santa Ana. Vote by mail inserts, good information out to the voters, closure signs, we can go through that website, thank you. We have in-person voting currently right now. Okay, so lessons learned. Definitely the communication for voters and knowing that the campaigns are going to be driving heavy in-person turnout. I know this for November, and that's something we've got to plan for and be able to properly social distance people in those minimized locations is going to be very difficult. And so I think that's something we all need to be cognizant of. Next slide and I'll be done. Challenges for November, finding people. We know this. Logistics for finding locations. We're already talking to sites that do not want to participate. So this is going to be a challenge, and we have to communicate correctly to vote to these locations and understanding we're partners in this and making sure that voters have their rights and the abilities to cast a ballot in November. But I also would acknowledge that we are a VCA county. We have an infrastructure kind of built in for this already, but there's still challenges for VCA counties. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity to present.
Hi, everyone. Next, we're going to go to Fred, but just really quickly, I just wanted to ask Neil a couple of questions that have come through on the Q&A, and I'll just ask them both at once so we can be quick here. So Neil, what is your plan for reaching voters in Orange County jails? And how does the procedures that you've outlined apply to those folks? And then the other question that I think that we can go ahead and answer now is how you protected confidential voter information while live streaming your recent recount activities.
So two great questions. One of the things that we're going to be doing very closely is working with our local sheriff's department on that jail outreach. We have done some, I think, really good work with the ACLU to make a robust outreach plan to inmates in the jail system. And we're not going to stop that. That's something that we're going to work closely with our sheriff's department on, and also use COVID-19 communication to these folks and letting them know what their options are. For the recount itself, we have protected ballots that might have distinguishing marks on them so that when people see that on the video live stream, that's something that would be redacted and they would not see that information. I think that's where your question's going, Jessica. Yeah, and also just making sure that you see the tally sheets and the ballot itself that's being called side by side, and so people can compare them as they're being marked, and they can also raise challenges on the online streaming service as well.
Okay, perfect. Next, we're going to go to Fred, and Fred, you can take it away.
facilities have been coerced into living a certain way by keeping at the home and be brought over them to complete a balance. Next slide. But what happened even more acceptable but family with a lot of brothers with disability more it was primary valor and when to have Americans believe their own is flexible. It was meant to more obvious about we have a demo on the video on our website. Our YouTube channel. Next slide. Some drawbacks are both some disabilities don't have access to the computer over internet that is overpopulation and people in rural areas. We have heard that some people don't feel private enough because some people may have buried in the envelope. And for Neil says, a lot of people try to use it and give up. That's what maybe a lot of people get it, but no, never back. Needs to be more outreach. Go ahead. Next slide. There needs to be a minimum number of in-person verifications. I believe that 1 in 10,000 voters is a possibility. We think that would be the compromise to allow for access and safety. Next slide. Then it should be accessible. Like under the VCA, non-VCA counties have a flexibility in that. Next slide. But that there'll be a lot less, but we will keep it. We'll make it all get the next of it. The next slide is the number that the voting machine should be at least 3 in case one breaks over the line or both. That like to be there. And outside just at the right time. Thank you.
In the interest of time, we're running a little bit short, so I'm going to go ahead and go straight to James, and then we'll pick up questions at the very end. Does that work for everyone? All right, James, it's all you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Schwab, Chief of Staff for Secretary of State Alex Padilla. And we're going to start off with a discussion on where we're at with the November election. So next slide, please. The opening slide right there is an image from Wisconsin and their primary election. We're hoping that Wisconsin and the lines we saw there and the impact and effect of the virus had on voters and poll workers that participated in that special election, we hope is not a preview of November, but a warning for us and what we need to do in the next 6 months to prepare. So what do we know today? We know that at some level, the virus will be impacting the election in November. And in October, November, and December, the important months for the election. We don't know to what extent or to what level, but I think all signs point to some level of impact, including ongoing health guidelines, social distancing directives, and others. So I think number one is we know there's not going to be a vaccine. And so public perception and reality of what voters are thinking and how they want to vote might change by the fall, given the fact that the lack of vaccine and we don't know exactly where we'll be with how prevalent the virus is going to be and how strict orders will be in the fall. We know that today the virus is impacting in-person voting locations and poll workers. And so you heard from Neil earlier, essentially as of today, we're simply losing locations and losing poll workers. Counties are doing their due diligence. They're reaching out to their communities. They're reaching out to their locations, and they're getting non-commitments or they're getting turned down. So we have a tremendous job ahead of us to fill that gap. We know that state and county budgets are severely impacted. At the state level, there's a $54 billion deficit that needs to be resolved. Just today, we were informed that our agency is going to face a 5% budget cut. Our employees are going to face a 10% pay cut, with furloughs likely coming. So in terms of resources available for November, it's even tougher road ahead. And we know that in-person voting options will need to change. And I say this not because of necessarily the number, but what they look like, how they feel. I think there's a range of items we need to do to make voters feel safe and confident that going to an in-person voting location will not endanger their health, that it can be a safe and healthy and secure way of voting. And so the look and feel of polling place is going to need to change. And election officials are going to have to add another hat to their responsibilities, and that's public health official. And again, another challenge for us looking ahead to November. So to give you a sense of what types of locations are used by counties, these are the kind of categorized locations by type. A significant number of locations are schools, religious facilities. A lot of the other category are, we think, garages or other private businesses or spaces. But you can look, there's a lot of facility types that might not be available to election officials in the fall. And so just to get a sense of sort of what's out there and some of the gaps we need to fill. So what's being done? Through the month of April, early March and early April, my office convened a working group to bring together our stakeholders from across the spectrum to discuss sort of, how do we respond to for November. We had daily meetings. We had sometimes 2 or 3 meetings a day, depending on our subcommittees and different topics we walked through. And we really dived deep on, how things have gone in the past, into the weeds in terms of the vote by mail process, conditional voter registration, USPS, the technology portion of it and the equipment needs, and try to understand a lot of what's working well, what might need to change. And we came up with a long list of specific recommendations for policy consideration, executive order, legislation, funding, guidance, and regulations. And the goal was to submit those to the legislature and the governor for action. I think a lot of that work will be incorporated into the legislation that's being introduced in both houses and possibly in a future executive order. And I'll get to the specifics of the working group a little bit later on, but that's in general. We came together, we did some work, we made recommendations, and I think we have a good grasp of a lot of the little items that need to be tackled, but sort of the big picture, which we'll talk in a minute about, is the in-person voting, the number of in-person voting requirements. We also have the Federal CARES Act, which is providing $36 million in federal funding to California and can be used for anything related to elections and responding to the virus. As I mentioned, there's state legislation that's been introduced. There's actually another federal bill, the HEROES Act, introduced in Congress that would appropriate another $3.6 billion to elections. There was the executive order on March 8th, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that just focused on sending every voter a ballot, registered voter a ballot for November. And then we're working towards finalizing those in-person requirements. And so this is sort of the hot topic. This is the controversy, is what do we do for in-person requirements? What's possible for November? We know that today, no one is saying yes. We know that the people that are going to staff those locations aren't signing up. We have a tremendous work ahead of us to find those locations, think creatively about what we can replace those locations with, and find the people to staff them. So that's sort of the final piece of here before we can really finalize our work and look for November. So here's a list. I know my time's running long. Here's a list of the other smaller items we got through with the working group. So there wasn't consensus on in-person requirements, but everything else there was good consensus on. Public education campaign, extending the voter registration deadline, extending the postmark +3 law, expanding the use of our ballot tracks technology, protecting language and disability access, expanding the use of remote accessible vote by mail, and engaging the USPS often so that we can ensure we understand the reality on the ground for the Postal Service. So the challenges ahead, what we're trying to do is unprecedented. Not only before the virus was wildfires and public safety power shutdowns, cybersecurity, misinformation going to be a challenge. We now have a virus in front of us, and what we're trying to accomplish by changing the amount and number and demographic of poll workers for November has not been done before by county election officials in our office. We're going into uncharted territories, and there's a lot of work ahead of us. That includes identifying, surveying, and committing likely 3,600 sites in the next 3 months. We need to make sure those sites meet operational accessibility and public health needs. We need to support counties moving to all vote by mail, recruit 26,000 plus poll workers, figure out how we're going to get money from a deficit, and then layer in the other challenges I mentioned earlier. It's going to be a tremendously difficult election for everyone. We need all hands on deck to support counties, to support our office in getting the election done. Thank you, Gail. Next slide. 2020 is the year we have to move mountains if we're going to succeed and provide an election that our voters deserve, uphold voting rights, but also an election that is safe and secure for election officials, their workers, and their volunteers. So final slide, and I'll leave you there.
Okay. All right. So we just have a few short minutes for questions. But I think that let's start with this one and see how long it takes us. One viewer is asking if there are any counties that appear to be doing a particularly bad or a particularly good job to make sure that the voting centers are accessible and that there are sufficient functioning, accessible voting machines. So any of you that feel comfortable addressing this can do so.
Okay, so I don't want to speak for my other county colleagues, but I will tell you this, that one of the things that we did early on in the VCA adoption was to make sure that we have 5 accessible devices instead of 3, which is required in statute, and making sure that we have adequate space, adequate distance for voters to be able to use a site. Now, this is the one thing I want to bring up as a challenge. I need sites that are about 1,200 square feet or more to have adequate social distancing, and we'll have to reduce the number of the disabled devices in order to meet that threshold. So I think, yes, the answer for us certainly is we're working towards that and planning for that. One last thing I want to add is we built a vote center lab just recently and opened that in our warehouse, which is kind of like Taco Bell in the corporate headquarters, where you have a Taco Bell store inside, and so you can test and you can try things and you can plan for what you're going to do in November, and we're doing that right now.
Okay, great. And then the last question, and this is for James, is with the California State University system announcing that they were going to be doing the vast majority of their classes online in the fall, have there been active discussions with that system to utilize their campus for in-person voting locations, since they'll have access to parking and fewer people on campus?
Yeah, I think I also heard similar movement from the UC system. And I know at least here in Sacramento, the community college system here is moving to online for the fall as well. So I assume community college districts will be doing the same. So I think that presents a couple of challenges. One, how are we going to outreach to college students? Usually they're on campus, you put a vote center there, they're going to show up and vote. And so college outreach is going to be a challenge for the fall. I think each county is going to have to assess how that campus works for their larger community. There are some campus vote centers that just cater to students, I think mostly students and staff. There's others where it was a blend of community members plus students. So I think on a campus by campus basis, we'll need to work with the UC, CSU, community college districts to see what can be available. The secretary's talked about, if it's probably a more safe and healthy option if there's actually no one on campus, right? There's less people that you're interacting with that might be a vector for the virus. And so it's going to be important to have colleges available for polling locations and vote centers. The question is, does it work for each of the counties depending on their specific needs?
Okay. And then the last question that we'll do, we can go over by just a minute, is and what are the rules in place for disqualifying vote by mail ballots? This particular questioner says that his was not counted.
So there's the missing signature, and then there's a mismatch signature. And for both of those issues, the county is required to reach out to you and provide you with notification about how to fix it. And that voter has until 2 days before certification of the election to fix whatever issue is available, whatever issue came up. I also want to plug ballot tracks. We want to expand it to every county in the state. It's like FedEx or UPS for your ballot. You can track it, and it sends you notifications, including a notification if there was an issue with your ballot. You get a text, an email, or a voicemail. And maybe Neil can get into the weeds about the signature mismatch process, but in general, those are the 2 ways you can have your ballot rejected. But there is a good opportunity for you, an opportunity for you to fix it in the weeks after Election Day.
Jessica, can I just add, it might be interesting for the viewers to note that about 30% of voters on average are responding to those notices. So that continues to grow.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's all the time that we have. This was a great panel. I would encourage the folks who did not get their questions answered to reach out directly to me or to the other panelists in the event that you still have a burning question we didn't have time to get to. But thanks so much, guys, for being here and participating on this panel. This was great.